Hi, and welcome to Hasidus for All again, and thank you very much for joining me. Today's topic is anger management, a subject that all of us can relate to, something that all of us have experienced in our lives, some more frequently than others. And so I think it's a very important subject to discuss, and we will be splitting this video into two. This week we'll be talking about the biblical perspective on anger, and next week we'll be talking about the Zohar's perspective on anger. So let's look at where anger stems from, what the Bible and our sages teach about successful anger management and the best response. And although there are different or varying opinions within Judaism as to the response to anger, we will be following the teachings of Hasidus and the Kabbalah, not only because they're the closest to my heart, but also because I find them the most helpful way and solution to manage anger. So what is anger and why do we get angry? I think that at first instance, in today's day and age, we might think of like a traumatic pain we go through or social injustice as the roots of anger. But then when we look at the Bible, we see the very same stories, and we see that our tzaddikim, our righteous people, did not react in these circumstances with anger. So for example, when the psalmist saw that the wicked flourish, he simply rested in God to deliver justice. When the prophets faced iniquity, they warned the people and they prayed for them a lot. And an iconic story about Joseph, when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, who actually even try to kill him, we see that this is a trauma so great that most of us can't even relate to. He did not get angry. On the contrary, he actually turned the curse into blessing. So what we do discern from the Torah then is anger in almost all the circumstances is either linked to jealousy or it's linked to coveting. And there is a sort of entitlement mentality, you owe me this, or God owes me this, or we get angry simply because things don't go our way. So if you think of the first murder story in the Bible, which is Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel because God favors Abel's offering or sacrifice, and then Jacob runs from Esau to Haran because Esau gets upset over his birthright being taken away. And Haran, this place of Haran is a very interesting place because it's linked to the word Haron, which means wrath. And certainly a lot of anger happens in Haran. So as we mentioned, Jacob runs from Esau, and also we read about Rachel getting quite upset because she can't conceive a child while her sister Leah is granted this blessing. And then we read about Laban, who furiously searches the tents of Jacob and his daughters in order to find his stolen idols. And the Haggadah is actually very strong or very harsh on Laban. It says that Laban sought to uproot everything. So we see another link in the story with Laban, obviously, because Laban is an idol worshiper. So there is a correlation here between anger and idol worship. And anger and idol worship are basically the two elements that form the mainstream narrative of Haran. So Haran is the place of idol worship and anger, which brings us to our next point, namely what our scriptures and our sages define as anger. And the Talmud informs us that anger is simply idolatry in the form of self-worship. The Talmud tells us that a person's true nature is revealed by how easily he's angered. And anger can obviously have severe consequences. If it's completely out of control, it can even lead to murder. So a person, we know that when we get angry, we lose our ability to think clearly. And we're told by the Talmud that the wise lose their wisdom and the prophets can lose their prophetic vision as a result of anger. Now, the Rambam also says that the person's overall quality of life can be diminished when one is often angry. For example, he cannot teach others, he becomes more vulnerable to the evil inclination, and his rage can lead to all sorts of other negative behaviors later. And most importantly, this person will not be able to achieve any positive spiritual growth. The one who is slow to anger, on the other hand, is called better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit is better than the one who takes a city. We're told in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually expounds beautifully on what it exactly means that when a person gets angry, he commits idolatry. Why is anger idolatry? And he tells us that the reason for this, because when a person gets angry, he basically denies the basic premise that God controls the world, and he simply loses faith in the divine providence. And the Tanya tells us when a person is harmed, the offense was already decreed in heaven, and God has many agents on earth through whom he can act. So even if the offending party had chosen otherwise, the offense would have still befallen the victim in any case. So if we really believe that what happens to us comes from God, we couldn't get angry in the first place. The offense was decreed in heaven, and then God chose an earthly agent to carry it out. Now, obviously, man has free choice, and that's true both about the offender and the offended party. So if you are the offended party, you have a free choice, so your anger remains unjustifiable. And as the offended party, you're angry about the damage caused to you, but this is a result of the lack of belief that it was a heavenly decree. So getting angry means that you don't have faith in what's happening to you really comes from God. Now, the person you're angry at is just a messenger, and again, going back to free will, that person also has free choice, so ultimately he will also be held accountable. But anger is not the answer. Rather than asking, why is this person hurting me? You can ask a bigger and better question, which is, what is God trying to tell me in this situation? And the Rebbe gives a wonderful step-by-step guidance to anger management made up of 4 points, which are quite easy, and I find them quite interesting. Number 1, wait before reacting. Not rocket science, something very simple we can all do. It all makes sense. It's a logical step to take. But also what's amazing about waiting before reacting is that when we do that, we actually mirror God's behavior and mirror God's response. If you remember the story about the golden calf, when Moses comes down from the mountain and he sees the sin of the golden calf, God speaks to him and God says, now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, against the Israelites. In other words, let me cool down and talk to me later. And the Bible tells us that we have a God who is slow to anger, and his anger is instantaneous. It doesn't last. So if we mirror God's behavior, we will also be angry only for just a short time, and our anger, we will be slow to anger as well. Number 2, remember someone is watching. So the Tanya tells us that God stands over us at all times, and the whole world is full of God's glory. And we're also called to serve God like one standing before a king. So remember, God sees everything. Number 3, remember the consequences. So if we react in anger, we will end up having to apologize later, obviously. And by nature, it's difficult for a person to apologize. It's difficult for a person to ask for forgiveness. So if we keep this in mind before we react, it might sway us from overreacting. Number 4, remember who's in charge. So as mentioned before, the offense was already decreed in heaven, and the offender merely acts as a deputy of God. So there's no need for you to direct your anger at this person, because ultimately God is in charge. And if you think of the greatest example again in the Bible of a person who followed these steps and embodied the anger management hero, it will be Joseph. And I think Joseph's story has intrigued me for years because of the way he overcomes his betrayal, the betrayal of his family. And I often wondered how come he didn't sort of descend into trauma mode. He didn't become an embittered person. On the contrary, he kept perspective of God's involvement in his life. And not only did he manage to forgive his brothers, but he also repaid the wrongdoing with a blessing. So I took the liberty to imagine that Joseph wasn't a tzaddik and he hadn't been born then, but he would be born in today's day and age, and he would be in the darkness of this very popular victim mentality today, and the self-entitlement, the boundless emotions. And I kind of imagine that the story would go somewhat like this. Once upon a time, there was a boy called Joseph who had many brothers. The first time it became apparent that something wasn't right with the boy is when he boasted to his brothers about a dream he had where his brothers would submit to him. And following this episode, his parents immediately took him to the psychiatrist, where he was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. When his brothers sold him into slavery, he decided that should he ever come across them again, he would kill them all. Once he was in Pharaoh's palace, Potiphar's wife took a liking to him and she seduced him. Joseph gave in. After all, you can't expect a young, healthy man to resist such a temptation. He was thrown into prison where many people came to ask him to interpret their dreams. He got really upset and shouted back at them uproariously, "Leave me alone. Can't you see I have problems of my own? Go away." So once he became Pharaoh's second in command, he had a lot of power in his hands, and he thought to himself, what a great opportunity. I'm so powerful now. This is a great chance for me to take a revenge on my brothers. So when the brothers appeared in the palace, Joseph had a total mental breakdown. He broke objects and furniture around him. He was wielding his knife at them. Subsequently, he was hospitalized and treated in a mental ward. He spent the rest of his life and all his financial savings on trauma counseling. When he got married and he raised a family, obviously he took all his anger out on them. He came home drunk every night, he beat up his wife, he was abusive to his children. And his children mirrored his example, and they became the same angry, bitter victims of life as him. And on it continued for generations. As a result, the whole Jewish nation became one big dysfunctional family. So we know that the narrative went quite the opposite way, and I think I'm compelled to believe that if we were all a little bit more like Joseph, psychologists would go bankrupt. And seriously speaking, you often wonder, how did Joseph handle his situation in a way that seems to go so much against everything we know about human nature? And I think the answer is that when we get angry, we're often told, that we lose perspective. We inflate situations, we blow them out of proportion, and oftentimes the problem or the offense is not as bad or not as big as we tend to think. So I imagine whatever you're going through right now might not be as bad or as big as, being sold by your own brothers, like in Joseph's case. And so his situation was big enough because his brothers even tried to or intended to kill him. So his situation was so big that it didn't actually need blowing out of proportion, but he kept perspective. So even though his situation was big, he kept perspective that there was something even bigger than his situation, which was God. And if you remember, Joseph said to his brothers, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. So he rejected anger, he rejected bitterness, he rejected revenge, and he responded to the circumstances with forgiveness and blessing. And this is what made it possible for the Jewish nation to be born. Without Joseph, it wouldn't have been possible. Not only did he not curse his brothers, but actually he did hesed, or loving kindness, unto them, because he promised to financially provide for them. And we don't really read about him engaging in fervent prayer, interestingly. Yet the Bible tells us that God was with him always. He found favor in prison, he found favor with Pharaoh, and I think he managed to turn all the people and all the situations around that surrounded him. And what was the key to his success? Obviously, we read that he trusted God, so that's essential, but the key to his success was that he had to make a consistent decision in every circumstance to rule his passions. And if you remember, we talked about Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, where it's told that he who rules his spirit is better than the one who takes the city. And we know that Joseph ended up not only taking a whole city, but a whole country, as he was appointed governor of Egypt. Now, we can have an even deeper understanding of this story if we bring the Sephirot into this, the emotional Sephirot, the emanations of God. And Judaism teaches us that the mind should rule over the heart. Now, unfortunately, that's not always the case. It's the ideal case, and sometimes our emotions take over, but in an ideal scenario, the mind should direct the heart. So when we meet in the Joseph story, when we meet this immature young Joseph, we see that, you know, he boasts to his brothers, so he's immature and his emotions completely rule him. And he has to go through this maturing process of reining in his emotions and arriving to the level of chokhmah, or wisdom, where the mind directs the heart, the brain directs the heart. And I think God is trying to tell us a wonderful message here about self-development, because we read about Joseph, the next time we read about Joseph in an emotional situation is when his brothers come to see him, and we read about him crying, you know, turning away, hiding, crying in secret. So we obviously see that he didn't become this rigid, unemotional person, but he manages to not act upon his emotions, but waits for the right time to reveal himself. Remember, the Rebbe said that we must wait for the right time, and we must wait before reacting. So, as you can imagine, it must have been really difficult for Joseph to conceal his identity for so long, but he waited for the right time to do so. And we know that all the 7 emotional sephirot are each linked to one of the forefathers, and the sephirah that is embodied by Joseph is Yesod, which is bond or foundation, because what he does is he forgives, and by forgiving, he restores peace and harmony in his family, which then allows the Jewish nation to be born. And Yesod, bond or connection, is a wonderful balance between Netzach, which is dominance or endurance, and Hod, which is humility and submission. And we see how beautifully Joseph balances these two, because, for example, when it comes to his relationship with God, he is completely submissive. And he acknowledges that his strength comes from higher places, and that whatever happens to him is for a higher purpose. But on the other hand, when he's tempted by Potiphar's wife, he exercises full dominance over her as well, because he's rejecting her temptations, but he also manages to conquer the lustful desires of the flesh. Now, there's another sephirah, which is Tiferet, which is compassion, which is very much central to Joseph's personality as well, because he shows compassion to his brothers when they first visit him. And basically, when he cries during their first visit, his tears are not really about himself, but they are for his brothers. So it's so interesting that in all these terrible misfortunes that befall him, that we read about, we don't see him cry a single time, except when his brothers visit him. And his tears are not the tears of self-pity, even at that time, but the tears of compassion. And wonderfully, the Zohar refers to Tiferet, the Sefer of Tiferet, compassion, which also has the connotation of beauty, as a garment dyed with many colors. Why is this garment so beautiful? What are all these colors that it's dyed with? It's the blending and the harmony of love and discipline that make up compassion. And if you remember, Joseph had a wonderful coat of many colors, which is actually a mystical symbol for compassion. So let's recap again and see what happens when you feel angry and what you need to remember. So step number 1, way before you react, we discussed this, that time is an essential factor. Time will give you the opportunity to let your emotions cool down, your brain to take over your heart, to direct your heart, and you can put things into perspective. And it will also obviously save you from the embarrassment of later having to apologize for your behavior. Number 2, remember the consequences of anger. So you can either end up engaging in self-idolatry, or worse, if your anger gets out of control, you can end up becoming a murderer, God forbid. And if you're constantly angry, in the long run, it can blind you to see clearly, and it can take you to further negative places, and it can also hinder your spiritual growth. Number 3, remind yourself that God is in control. So we discussed that the offense was already decreed in heaven to test you, and therefore, because everything that we go through is a test, you need to seek the higher purpose. Don't take your anger out on the messenger. You need to remember that Joseph cried not for himself, but for his brothers. Number 4, examine the root of your anger. This is very important, because if you examine the root of your anger and you immediately come to the conclusion that it's either jealousy or coveting, then that's it. You know that you need to repent. Those are the wrong feelings. If, on the other hand, it's out of injustice or pain, you can pray for the offender just like the prophets did. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you again for joining me. In the second part, we will look at what the Zohar says about anger and how we can actually harvest the energy of anger to transform it into godly things. Thanks for joining, and have a great day.